sometimes humanity takes a break in its hectic schedule of being a colossal dick to each other every single day and takes the time to produce a truly great piece of art. The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Johannes Vermeer, The Great Wave by Katsushika Hokusai, The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo, and The Imperial Knight by Jez Goodwin. In a world divided by its views on race, gender, the correct sauce to go with chips, and whatever else you absolute monsters are getting furiously upset about today, at least we can all agree on that. I'm a strong believer that tabletop miniatures are art. It's why this channel hosts a painting competition for old miniatures every year, and if the British Museum ever gives in and actually has an exhibit dedicated to the history of Warhammer miniatures, this model needs to be in a section all by itself. Now, you might assume that the man in the internet box is making a funny joke or being hyperbolic, and yes, a portion of this is subjective. However, there is a common thread that links this giant robot to many of the greatest works of art in history. A golden thread, if you like. But hold on 1 second, as my wife always says, I'm going too fast. I first need to explain what on earth an Imperial Knight is before I can give you all the ammo you need to convince your partners that the next time you return home carrying bags of plastic crack after going out for your weekly butter and cheese shop, you are in fact investing in the next Rothko. Starting from the beginning, imagine a cold winter's morning in 1990 in the UK in the middle of June, and Games Workshop had just shown off a staple of the sci-fi genre, a new robot model. These particular models were only a few centimeters high because they were for the popular at that time game of epic Space Marine, 6mm scale warfare in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Designed by the hero in our story, Jez Goodwin, and having background written by Andy Chambers, the rules for these were as svelte and restrained as you could expect for the time period, taking up a streamlined 20 full pages, 5 of which were illustrations. The rest involved rewriting huge portions of the core rule system to add the unique weapons and shielding they were all armed and armoured with. You had 4 templates and 4 sets of tokens to individually cut out and use during play to keep track of various conditions that your Imperial and Elder Knights would find themselves in. The rules even contained a mini experience system to level up the pilots in between linked games, where you could promote your squires to full knights and eventually to lords themselves, plus rules about how those lords could survive those battles if their machines were destroyed. It was very, very clear that at least for one person, these models were proving to be a well of inspiration. The first House Knights were simply called the Warden, the Lancer, and the Paladin, taking up the archetypes of the shooty one, the close combaty one, and the all-rounder. The Paladin looks as you would expect today, cannon in one hand, chain blade in the other, just like me walking to the shops. The Warden had a couple of different looking models, one of which actually had tracks, which kind of makes it look like the ancestor to the Khorne Lord of Skulls. But somehow, some way, the original Knight Lancer looked even weirder. It looks like the medieval monks that did Marginalia imagined what a giant robot would look like and then decided to give it massive flared trousers. I suspect that the long-rumoured prevalence of mind-altering substances floating around in the Games Workshop design studio at the time might in fact be true. The forces of chaos were not mentioned, but what was mentioned were the Elder Knights, the Fire Gale, Towering Destroyer, and the Bright Stallion. And as you can guess, they were just as weird as their Imperial cousins. If there was any doubt to the claim of the studio being fueled by less than legal substances, this issue's Warhammer Fantasy model collection contained a Chaos Champion on War Griffin, drawn wearing a top hat. And not on the champion, the actual Griffin itself was wearing a top hat. As with all things, the constant pressure to release miniatures meant that this opus was quickly buried by the next big thing. But 4 years later, in November 1994, the Knights came back for a second go. Epic Space Marine had been doing pretty well, but as you can probably guess, the amount of rules that had been published in single-use monthly magazines made it fairly challenging to actually get into. So along came Titan Legions, a kind of version 2.5 of the rule set. In this box you got the legendary Imperator Titan and a couple of Mega Gargants, and to go with them came an absolute ton of plastic Orc battle wagons and Paladin Knights. And this time the Knights got a whole lot more. There were all metal Knight Errants, a seeming replacement for the concept of Squires, and all metal Crusader Knights, a seeming replacement for the Warden, which was just gone for some reason. The next month came some metal Paladins, Lancers and Castellans. Those metal Paladins immediately looking much nicer than the plastic models in the box set. Finally, along came the metal command models for the Errant, Paladin and Lancer, as well as the larger Knight model, the Baron. Also during this time, Epicast, a US-based distributor, had the license to produce larger scale miniatures in resin that Games Workshop were unable or unwilling to make themselves, and they produced a few of these Knights in 40k scale, including the Knight Paladin. To give an example of how rare these models are, I can't find any shots of the Knight Crusader model that they allegedly produced anywhere on the internet. If any of you have one, please take a picture and email it to me using the links in the description. I will spend the long dark nights staring at it and possibly even sharing it from time to time with my Ko-fi subscribers who are bravely keeping the channel running. If I don't receive one, I might truly never make it through the winter. Enough people supporting me will make my dream of a totally ad-free channel a reality, so if you're tired of skipping ads for mushroom-powered energy drinks or life insurance or whatever unskippable horrors YouTube has dredged up, consider supporting me for as little as £2 a month. Anyway, back to giant robots. Despite this burst of releases, the Imperial Knight faction ran into problems. It's the same old chestnut, the sales weren't high, the Titan Legions box was pretty weirdly constructed, containing an absolute ton of data cards and tokens for every single faction. It was more a supplement than a fresh start. Either way, a lot of the promised releases never arrived. The Warmonger Titan ended up being a mail order upgrade kit, but the epic Elder Exodites and Squat Juggernauts were never heard of again. There was, after all, a younger and hotter game on the block at this time, namely the second and soon-to-be third edition of Warhammer 40,000. 28mm scale sci-fi gaming had rapidly overtaken its smaller cousin, or larger cousin, depending on your perspective, and 40k couldn't support these massive knights that would dwarf everything around them. In fact, the knights even vanished from their own game. When the next version of Epic was released, Epic 40,000, it had a much simpler and abstracted rule set, but it bombed even before the knights were mentioned. They ended up in the Citadel Journal with rules by Gav Thorpe. The knights seemed destined for the same rubbish bin the Exodites had gone into, being completely out of place in a world surrounded by 28mm miniatures. But the revival for them came in an unexpected place. 40k was so popular and kept selling so well that people wanted to use bigger armies, and Games Workshop was very happy to sell people more of the same kit they already had. But as anyone who has ever considered jamming a syringe full of anabolic monkey hormones into their backside knows, size does in fact matter. What if Games Workshop could sell larger model kits as a kind of army centerpiece? In 2007, Warhammer 40,000 Apocalypse was released. This legendary rule set enabled truly massive games, and with this, Games Workshop invested in a machine to create even larger plastic sprues, twice the size of their normal ones. Out rolled the first ever plastic Baneblade and Hellhammer multi-part kit, a massive, at the time, Imperial Guard super heavy tank. And with one breath, every single miniature gamer in the world said, "But I want a super heavy vehicle for my army." And Games Workshop looked down and said, yes. The dam was breached and a torrent of models followed. Orc players got a Stomper. Tyranid players got a multi-part Trigon. Chaos players got a giant train thing. Necron players got a combined Obelisk and Tesseract Vault kit. Tau players got a Riptide. Elder players got a Wraith Knight. Meanwhile, Space Marine players got a pat on the back and a wink. Their Storm Raven gunship technically made up for the fact that a Thunderhawk was simply too big to be made into plastic, but it always looked a bit weird to me. But lo, Games Workshop looked down from their tower and thought, what if we made a kit that almost everyone can add into their army, and it could be taken as a faction on its own? And in March 2014, out came the Imperial Knight. This kit made both a Knight Paladin and a Knight Errant, and people went mental. As you can expect, this was a super heavy vehicle that could be easily added into every Space Marine army. In fact, it could be added into every Imperial army in the game. It didn't matter that the rulebook that was released with them, their 6th edition codex, was invalidated within a year for a new edition. People brought more. It didn't matter that the kit was re-released the following May with a combined missile pod that looked suspiciously like a part that had been very clearly and deliberately omitted from the original release, as it slotted into the hole at the top of the Knight that had been there since the beginning. As this was the time that the CEO was asking the designers to extract as much value from these kits as possible. Naughty naughty smacky botty, said all the players, before continuing to buy the new kit in enormous quantities. And lo and behold, a few competitive players realised that the base on one of these things was so large you could effectively use it to block huge areas of the battlefield from your opponents. Whoops, said the players, before continuing to buy more. It turned out that none of that mattered, because it was a good looking kit that was incredibly accessible to everyone. But this model wasn't just thrown together by accident. The reason why I've compared this to the Sistine Chapel is because both Michelangelo's masterpiece and the Imperial Knight have been designed with the help of the old friend of the artist, the golden ratio. This mathematical concept pops up in many great works of art. To put it simply, if you have a rectangle and you remove a bit to leave a square, the bit that you removed can be scaled up to form the original rectangle again. This allows you to make an infinitely reoccurring pattern, and once you transpose this onto, for example, the girl with the pearl earring, it looks like this. Transpose this frame onto the Great Wave, and it looks like this. On the creation of Adam, it looks like this. And wouldn't you know what happens when you transpose it onto a scale drawing of the Imperial Knight? Go on, guess what it's going to look like. Yeah, it looks just like this. The proportions fit almost perfectly. In fact, I'm going to go out and say that this is the best robot in sci-fi. From Cybermen to Cylons and Terminators to Transformers. If that wasn't enough from an ease of building perspective, this thing needs to be studied by everyone. I recently fell down an internet rabbit hole wondering how you would go about making a scale model of a wooden boat, and it turns out you make a wooden boat by literally making a wooden boat, pinning and gluing the planks in place one by one and then filing them down. With the Knight kit, the entire inner skeleton can be assembled, sprayed silver and then painted to preference. Meanwhile, the armoured plates can be put on sub-assemblies, sprayed whatever colour you like, and then easily glued into place, concealing any holes. It's so easy, I wouldn't be surprised if you took all the individual parts of the kit, sealed them in a box, fired them into space, and in zero gravity, the kit would just assemble itself automatically. For my money, the Imperial Knight kit in its modern form is the best model Games Workshop have ever made. And they have now made an absolute ton of them. As well as the 5 variants that you could make with the original box, you now have the armigers to go with them, smaller mini knights. Also, in 2018 came the Dominus class chassis, a slightly larger knight that built a Castellan or a Knight Valiant. Then came the first ever Knight special character, Sir Hector, and his custom Knight Canis Rex, a new Knight Preceptor class. As usual, Forge World couldn't stop themselves and came up with the increasingly harder to say Knight Asteris and Knight Porphyrodon, as well as upgrade kits that built a Mechanicum Knight Magaria and Knight Styrix. In 2023, we got a Cerastus Knight Lancer, Knight Archeron, and Knight Castigator, a technically impressive feat in both scale and the fact that the variants had a glueless plastic hose and ammo feed that could be reposed after assembly. Even Chaos got in on the act. You don't just have to paint your knights differently if you wanted corrupted versions of them. You can buy a Knight Abominant, a Knight Desecrator, and Knight Rampager, as well as the smaller War Dog Carnivore, Stalker, and Brigand. Finally, for now, we have the Knight Defender, with its Conversion Beam Obliterator, Void Shield Generator, and Plasma Executor. Not Executioner. An Executor is the person named in a will who is legally responsible for managing and distributing a deceased person's estate. As well as a new Chaos Knight, the Ruinator, with its much less confusing Dark Flame Lance and Felbor. What will the future hold? Will we ever see a plastic Knight Atropos or a Knight Moriax? Who knows? Probably. I honestly wouldn't put it past them. If you want to see more 40k faction videos, click this one here, and I'll see you next time.